The weight of small decisions. When Daniel first started working at the council office in Birmingham, nothing felt particularly dramatic, and that was exactly what made it difficult. There were no big problems, no clear failures, no obvious success either. Just a quiet, steady routine that somehow made him question everything. He would sit at his desk most mornings, staring at emails that all looked the same, feeling like something in his life didn't quite add up. It wasn't that he hated the job, but it didn't sit right with him either, and that kind of discomfort was harder to explain than simple frustration. He often found himself thinking about how he had ended up there in the first place. It had never been a dream, not even a clear plan. It just happened slowly, step by step, one decision leading to another, until he reached a point where he couldn't easily go back. When his manager once asked if he saw himself staying long-term, Daniel had replied politely, but inside he couldn't help thinking that he had never actually chosen this path. He had simply followed what seemed practical at the time, and now he was living a life that felt acceptable but not meaningful. There was a moment, one rainy afternoon, when everything started to shift. He had been working on a report for hours, trying to make sense of numbers that seemed disconnected from real life. A colleague leaned over and said they needed to figure this out before the deadline, and Daniel nodded, even though he knew it was easier said than done. The pressure wasn't intense, but it was constant, like a quiet weight that never really went away. They were on a tight deadline, as usual, and everyone acted as if that was normal, as if stress had simply become part of the job description. Later that day, during a short break, Daniel stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy. He checked his phone and saw a message from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in months. It had simply said, "It's been on my mind lately that we should catch up." Daniel stared at the message for a long moment. He had meant to reply, of course. He always meant to, but life had a way of filling every small space until even simple things like replying to a message felt like a task he would get round to eventually, though eventually rarely came. When he finally replied, suggesting they meet, he noticed something strange. He felt nervous, not because of the meeting itself, but because it forced him to step outside the routine he had built. He realized he had become a person who preferred predictability, even if that predictability made him unhappy. That realization caught him off guard. He wasn't used to seeing himself that way. The meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon at a small cafe near the city centre. When Daniel arrived, his friend was already there, sitting by the window, looking exactly the same and completely different at the same time. They greeted each other warmly, but after the initial conversation, there was a brief pause, the kind that often reveals more than words. His friend leaned back and said, "So, what's really going on with you?" Daniel hesitated. He could have given a simple answer, something safe and easy, but instead he said, "I'm not entirely convinced that I'm where I'm supposed to be." Saying it out loud made it more real, more serious. His friend nodded slowly, as if that answer made perfect sense. As they talked, Daniel realized something important. He had been waiting for a clear sign, a moment that would tell him exactly what to do next. But life didn't seem to work that way. There was no sudden clarity, no dramatic turning point. Just small choices, repeated over time. His friend pointed out that maybe he was overthinking everything, that sometimes it was better to give things a go instead of analyzing every possible outcome. Daniel understood the point, but he also felt that rushing into something new without thinking it through might create even bigger problems. Over the next few weeks, that conversation stayed with him. It was always there, somewhere in the back of his mind, quietly influencing the way he saw his daily routine. He began to notice things he had ignored before. How often he said yes to things he didn't care about. How rarely he made decisions based on what he actually wanted. He started to question whether he and the people around him were really on the same page, or just pretending to be for the sake of convenience. At work, he began to change in small ways. When a new project was introduced, instead of immediately agreeing, he paused and said he would look into it before committing. It was a simple shift, but it made him feel slightly more in control. His manager seemed surprised at first, but then accepted it. Daniel realized that many of the limits he felt were not actually real. They were just habits he had never questioned. One afternoon, when things became particularly overwhelming, he almost fell back into his old patterns. He felt the familiar pressure building, the sense that everything needed to be done immediately, perfectly, without mistakes. But this time, instead of reacting automatically, he stopped. He took a breath and reminded himself that no system was perfect, that it was okay if things weren't ideal. That small moment of awareness changed the rest of his day. Outside of work, he made an effort to reconnect with people. Not in a dramatic way, but slowly, one conversation at a time. He began to appreciate how much difference it made to simply stay in touch, to keep people posted instead of disappearing into his routine. These were not big, life-changing actions, but they added something new to his life, something that had been missing for a long time. Still, not everything became clear. There were days when he felt uncertain, when he found himself in two minds about every decision. Should he stay in his job or leave? Should he take a risk or play it safe? There were no easy answers, and he had to accept that. What he could control, however, was how he responded to that uncertainty. He stopped expecting perfect clarity. Instead, he focused on making decisions that felt reasonable, even if they weren't perfect. If something seemed worth a try, he would give it a go. If something didn't feel right, he allowed himself to step back. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was real. One evening, as he walked home, he realized something simple but important. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel stuck. He didn't have all the answers, and his life wasn't suddenly exciting or extraordinary, but it felt possible. And sometimes that's enough.